Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching and listening to our latest episode of UCLA Forecast Direct. My name is William Yu. I'm an economist at UCLA Anderson Forecast. Today, we are very honored and delighted to have Mr. Martin Chorzempa to talk about U.S. China relationship. Martin is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He was a Fulbright scholar in Germany and a Rhodes Scholar at Peking University. Martin holds a master's degree from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also the author of The Cashless Revolution, China's Reinvention of Money, which the Financial Times named one of the best economics books of 2022. Martin is an expert on China, technology, and capital markets. So Martin, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So let's go to the cut to the chest. So let's begin with this broad question. So 2 weeks ago, right before the APEC meeting, President Biden and Xi had a meeting in San Francisco. So what do you think about this meeting? Do you think it's a change? Do you think this meeting signal a change of the U.S.-China relationship? What are your major takeaway from this meeting?
Sure. So I think the change was already signaled quite a few months before this meeting. And the fact that it happened at all is a sign that there's some improvement in U.S.-China relations. The U.S. prioritized, as many of you know, sending cabinet-level officials to China who engaged in more substantive discussions on their areas of expertise. And then overall, the two heads of state decided to meet together. And I think both want, for various reasons, to set a kind of floor on the relationship and not let things spiral out of control. And I think both sides got something they wanted out of the meeting. Maybe the U.S. got more than China because some of its specifics asks around fentanyl, for example, and military to military communications were things that were positive breakthroughs in that. And the U.S. doesn't necessarily have much in the way of concessions. I couldn't think of a single concession it would have necessarily given China in this meeting. But there's a sense that things need to be communicated all the way to the head of state level in China for them to guarantee that it actually reaches the ultimate decision maker, which increasingly is a single individual in China. So it's very positive, and in a sense, having a positive outcome and this kind of summit with a good set of deliverables keeps the countries working together on areas where they can work together and creates a positive environment for some of the more working level collaboration to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well. Yeah, I fully agree with you. So what do you think? Do you think China is happy, is satisfied with this meeting and the result?
I think that China, when I was just in China, we discussed quite a bit with various Chinese individuals with varying connections to the leadership. And one of the things they wanted to do is try and push a redefinition of the relationship between the US and China as not just being defined by competition. As you know, the US policy towards China is essentially this invest, align, compete, invest at home, align and build coalitions with countries around the world to have a more unified policy. And then that is to compete more effectively with China. The US sees that as completely compatible with collaboration on a wide variety of issues, but China wants to create a more rhetorical focus around mutual respect and win-win cooperation and model of, that kind of thing. And the U.S. really didn't budge at all on that. So in a sense, China might not have gotten exactly what it might have hoped for, but I don't really think that they went into this likely expecting that there was going to be some breakthrough on some of their asks. I think that they didn't necessarily expect that the U.S. was going to reduce national security export controls or sanctions or anything. It was more of a way to just really maintain high-level communication between the two. So the fact that that it was respectful and there weren't really a bunch of negative headlines about it, it didn't negotiations to make the summit work didn't break down. I think all that is very positive and significant from the Chinese perspective, and gives hopefully from their perspective gives businesses hopefully more sense that that the relationship is a bit more stable and they don't necessarily need to be so afraid of things spiraling out of control. Although any business doing business between the U.S. and China is obviously going to have to be very careful about potential future trajectory, especially if a different president takes office in the United States in not too long.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So you mentioned about this national security. So I would like to ask this following question. So in July, you wrote a policy brief on the U.S. export ban on advanced semiconductor components and equipment to China, which took place in October 2022. I think you there was an excellent report, very detailed, clear explanation of the global supply chain on semiconductor. I enjoy a lot. So could you share with us what do you think are the goals of this ban, and how, because it was 1 year ago implemented, and how far do you think it achieved its goals? What's the impact on U.S. and other global supply chain participants for this ban?
Yeah, it's a big question. What I'll just give you at first an overview of what the U.S. did. Mm-hmm. Last October, it restricted only about a handful of different types of extremely advanced chips, generally GPUs, which are used to train AI algorithms and are used in things like supercomputers. And those have the strictest controls, including using extraterritorial means to say that these chips, almost all of which are made with some U.S. technology somewhere in the supply chain, cannot be shipped to China, even if they're made in a fabrication facility in, say, Taiwan or Korea. And then another side of it is designed to stop China from being able to develop its own chip manufacturing industry for advanced chips, which would effectively, make it impossible for the U.S. to, in the future, put controls on on semiconductors to China, because they could just make their own instead of buying them from someone that the U.S. could have leverage over. And the goal here is fundamentally driven by a few factors. One of them is just the understanding of importance of AI, and in an era in which you can't really control open source algorithms or data. One of the things the U.S. government could control is one of the inputs to developing advanced AI systems, which is the advanced chips that are needed, the GPUs which are needed to train those algorithms. So I think they bet that restricting that would help maintain a lead in potentially militarily relevant AI systems. And the bet that they made is that the negative commercial impact on U.S. firms of being unable to sell those kind of chips to China would be outweighed by the national security benefit of China not having access to that technology. And then just more broadly, the sense that that advanced semiconductors are going to be important to military competition. And if you're thinking about, potential future scenarios across the strait between the U.S., between the mainland and Taiwan, then people might believe that a lead in semiconductors could have an impact on how some sort of future scenario would play out. If we fast forward to a year later, the U.S. government had clearly believed that it had not really achieved all of its goals, to at least a large extent, including from the fact that Huawei has been able to get access to fabrication facilities to make advanced chips that, according to export controls, probably should not legally be allowed to be sent to Huawei, and that's an indication that these have been circumvented. One of the other things they did was increase the tightness of what is able to be sent to China. So I said it was only a handful of chips, and last October 7th. This October 17th, the U.S. tightened it and included a lot more chips, which are included in things like data centers and stuff. And there's a lot of concern in China that the cloud computing industry, for example, will be heavily negatively impacted by this. And they also expanded it to other countries. The idea being that if a Chinese firm can just set up a subsidiary in the UAE, for example, and order a bunch of these chips and then port them over to China, you don't have a very effective control if it only goes to China. So it's an incredibly complex set of rules. Each October 17th and last October 7th add up to many, many hundreds of pages in one of the world's most complicated supply chains. But the overall message is that the U.S. is really trying to find ways to control dual-use technologies of the future with a lot of unclear commercial and national security implications. And the jury is still out on really how effective those are likely to be and what the outcomes will be. We don't really know what the impact of AI is going to be on weaponry, for example. That's something we'll have to see play out. But the U.S. doesn't want to take the risk that these things proliferate first.
So, great. So, Martin, do you think more this kind of restriction will be coming in the future?
The U.S. has said that they're going to update these restrictions every year. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get tighter every year in every way. In some ways, they could be loosened if the idea is that, this control is not effective or it's outdated, let's say, that, usually the trend in export controls is that you control something that's really high end that you can actually restrict. And then as time goes on, that high end thing becomes pretty low end. Kevin Wolf, who led export controls under Obama, says the iPhone in your pocket would have been controlled as a supercomputer not that long ago and would have been subject to extreme export restrictions, but now it's kind of regular consumer technology. So that's something to watch, is that they'll be adjusted in that way. The U.S. has a lot of restrictions in the works. One of them is on outbound investment into China, especially kind of PE and venture capital investment. That's going to take quite a while to finalize. And then we could see some restrictions on access to cloud services, because if China can't access these chips in terms of buying them, then the U.S. might not want them to be able to rent access to them either through cloud computing services located outside of China. That's another really complicated undertaking that's not particularly easy.
Okay, good. So in your piece, you mentioned about how the Korean semiconductor firms are impacted by this ban. And there are two questions I would like to ask you as a follow-up. You mentioned that Korean, I think it's Samsung, had a memory chips in Xi'an, and then I think I did not know the number. I do know they had a huge footprint in China, which accounts about 40% of their production amount, and they just, I think, I don't know, is it a total investment or just a recent upgrade? $25 billion, Korean investment in Xi'an, and then right now they got caught off guard with this ban. So, just simple question: why did Korean company invest this huge amount of money in China? Is it Chinese government? Do you know they offer some kind of benefit subsidy, or they say if you want to sell chip in China, you have to invest in China? Do you know what's going on? I was surprised to see this huge number. They choose to invest in China. They don't want to invest in Korea or other maybe safer place.
Yeah. So memory, as you know from reading my piece, is this really cutthroat business focused on margins. And so anytime you can be cost competitive, that's the most important, one of the most important. The other is access to advanced technology, which is now no longer assured for operations in China. I haven't looked in detail into the reasons the decision was made to produce in China, but China has been investing a lot in trying to develop clusters of semiconductor production. So there would have been a large number of incentives for them to do so. That in terms of carrots, let's say, instead of sticks, it wouldn't necessarily, if you look at China's trade data, you see that semiconductors are one of its largest imports. So it still imports a huge number of the semiconductors that go into devices, many of which will be used in China, many of which will be exported to the rest of the world. And in terms of these facilities, if you put this into broader context, the way it's been most reported on is with Apple. When Apple decided to produce in China, the local government even went to the extent of helping them hire workers so they didn't have to go and find workers on their own, and created this special kind of free trade zone in the middle of China so that it wouldn't have to deal with customs formalities to assemble iPhones that would be exported to the rest of the world. So you see that as a general pattern, not necessarily just the central government, but oftentimes the local governments will be involved in providing a lot of assistance to firms that are bringing what's perceived as advanced, useful technology into China. Not necessarily to take that in any sort of nefarious way, but because they want to develop their region. And I would also note that as we've seen in the U.S. with the CHIPS Act, there's general, and with some reports on the semiconductor industry by BCG, that subsidies to produce semiconductor manufacturing fabrication facilities are rampant all around the world. And so getting subsidies from China to do so is not out of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the report, you also mentioned something I found it very interesting, that you mentioned that actually this ban on semiconductor might benefit Korean company because the potential future competition from China will be curtailed by this ban. So could you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. So the main potential threat was a company called YMTC, which looked poised to be becoming a memory supplier to Apple, and grew quite rapidly from a small company to one that could potentially be really competitive near the cutting edge of what's called NAND, which is the memory, like flash memory, that's used on phones and other kinds of devices. And effectively what these controls have done is make it really, really difficult for those firms to get the software and equipment that they need to be able to produce the chips that they want. And therefore, coming especially at a time when the memory market was in a glut, there was a benefit to the Korean firms from not having to face this, potential very heavily subsidized competition in comparison to the currently relatively cozy memory market, where there are only a few players that are able to play at the top levels required to get to the cutting edge.
So, so Martin, in our conversation, you mentioned about this AI, and I heard that President Biden and President Xi talk about this AI competition in the summit. But I didn't see the details. So do you have any kind of insight? What do they talk about, about this competition? Because I feel like, this big, two countries were not really ill, in terms of controlling this AI technology. Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, the details are not terribly detailed that have been released so far. My sense is it's around cooperating on AI safety kind of issues, and some discussion about limits that should be put on autonomous, AI weapon systems. You're trying to avoid the Terminator scenario, if you will. And I think that's something that's positive. This fits into a pattern of, including on export controls, where the U.S. and China have agreed to have these working groups where they discuss. I think it's just useful to have a mechanism to get the people who are thinking about AI safety in the U.S. and those who are thinking about it in China together to have a discussion. Whether something concrete will come out of it in terms of, some agreement is, not necessarily something I'd be holding my breath for, but it's positive that there will be a discussion of views between two of the leading countries in AI development.
Very well. Okay, so in October, you wrote a piece about China's new rule on data regulation, which might signal a more pro-business environment in China. So, so we know that our Commerce Secretary, Raimondo, was in China in early September, and she mentioned something coming from the business leaders' reflection that China is uninvestable. So, so do you see any kind of a reaction change, in terms of investment environment in China based on what you wrote about this specific policy? And could you talk about this specific data regulation policy change?
Yes. So there are a large variety of regulatory changes in China, which have led to less confidence in investing in China from the business community. Ranges for everything from, all of a sudden shutting down the whole online tutoring business, which was a multi-billion business, to the crackdown on internet platform companies, including antitrust scrutiny and a ton of data security and data protection regulation. Many of these rules, by the way, at least respond to a real societal problem. And whether or not you think that the response is proportional, I think doing something about it is useful. They probably did too much, too far at once, in a kind of campaign style, as we call it, regulation, where it's just a flood of rules, and that makes it really difficult for a business to understand what the environment is, what's going to be permitted, and all of that. One of the elements of that push is around data security, and one of the most important subsets of that is cross-border data transfers. If you are a business, international business that's doing business in China, or even a Chinese business that has subsidiaries and activities abroad, you need to be bringing data in and out of China. Not necessarily all the different types of data you use, but you need to have different pieces of your company able to talk to each other. And you need to be sure that doing that is legal. That's, includes sharing information. Think about a payment where information about that payment is going to be on both sides of that transaction, say between the U.S. and China. And we got to a point earlier this year where if they applied the regulations strictly as they were written, then essentially nobody would be allowed to exchange any data cross-border in very wide, subjective areas. And that would effectively make companies have to completely wall off their Chinese subsidiaries, would make it very difficult for them to manage it. And it would also be a real headache for Chinese firms. And so in a sense, this became one of the main symbols for the security side running amok and coming at a massive cost to doing business in China, and a deterioration of the business environment. And they effectively threw in the towel, or at least put things off until later, and proposed to significantly alter those regulations in a way that was beneficial to business. And so if you look at something like that, I think it matters a lot more than the endless statements that you see from the State Council and other Chinese government bodies about how they're going to improve access to finance, or they're going to improve these other things. And improve the business environment. There have been promises on this front for many, many years, but what businesses are really looking for is a sign that actual policy making when there's, as Chinese would say, a 利益冲突, when there's a conflict between security and or at least a extreme view of security and development, that development and openness can actually win out at times, and that the concerns of the business community, when there is a real problem in the regulations, actually leads to a real change. So they're looking for substance, and so far it seems that there hasn't really been that much yet in the way of real substance that would make me think that the policy direction that they took in that policy is going to be a new trend, but it's something to watch for. I wouldn't rule it out, but I wouldn't think it's going to go too far.
So let me ask you, for example, in terms of data flow, let's just say that Tesla, autonomous car, people driving Tesla in China, within China, would those image data be able to flow back to the Tesla headquarters in the United States or not, under this new rule or not? Do you know?
I don't know to that level of specificity. The rules that I wrote about are still, to my knowledge, draft rules, and would need to be finalized. But I would think that kind of data would be considered very sensitive, and probably still would not be able to be, they might be able to use that within China to help refine some algorithm, but like raw images taken along Chinese streets with routes of who's driving where, that kind of thing is probably not likely to get permission to be able to be transferred cross-border. What we're mainly talking about here are things like HR data, knowing who works for you, knowing who your customers are, financial data, that kind of thing. And there's but personal data is much more, and including personal data on customers is something that's more sensitive. So I wouldn't bet on that.
Okay, so I wonder, maybe maybe you don't know. Right now there are a lot of electric EV cars are made in China, shipped to Europe. So I wonder, would those kind of data privacy rule applied as well? So yeah, do you know that?
I don't know, but my sense would be that EU data privacy rules would apply. But mainly the criticism that they've been aiming is at United States companies that are bringing data from European citizens into the United States rather than Chinese. But I think that could change as EVs especially EVs with all these cameras and data accumulation become a much larger part of the European auto market. In general, Chinese authorities are much more concerned about data on Chinese people flowing abroad than they are about data on foreigners coming into China. So I don't think the Cyberspace Administration would particularly care about a data flow, about scrutinizing a data flow moving in that direction. That's probably something they would encourage because it would help refine their, self-driving algorithms, and would perceivably benefit China without any negative impact on Chinese citizens' privacy.
Yeah, very well. Okay, so I would like to kind of ask this final question, which could be also broad. So in September, Secretary of State Blinken, I think in Johns Hopkins University, said that the post-Cold War order has come to the end. I don't know if you heard of that. So what do you think about that statement? And given what we had seen over the past few months, this kind of development, this leader meeting, and this kind of a productive kind of a adjustment, the escalation. So I'm a little bit confused, what kind of a role U.S. China relationship will be playing out in the future. Do you think it's more of, as you said, competitors, or more of rivals? Because if based on Blinken's kind of a statement, it seems he is implying this new Cold War has begun. So what do you think?
I actually would bring in the way that the European Union has officially described this, which is China is a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, a rival of systems. I definitely see at that level. There are useful parallels between the Cold War and the current situation, but I think it's really easy to read too much into those parallels. China is so much more integrated to the world economy than the Soviet Union ever was. It's more of just an individual country, doesn't have the huge, the large amount of country close allies that the Soviet Union had during that period. So it's difficult to say. And at the same time, a lot of the Bretton Woods institutions and other elements of the order continue to exist, but some of them are being hollowed out, including by actions the U.S. is taking for example, in the WTO. So I think where we're at now is that U.S. China rivalry has led to a lot of frustration with the current order and not really much of a sense of what could replace it. There's a talk of you could imagine a scenario where kind of global leadership falters and we get a lot more chaos because we don't really see a new round of institution building. China's building some institutions like the AIIB and others, but they don't really replace the existing World Bank, for example. So I think we're kind of, the rules-based international order has always been, maybe to some extent, to a great extent real, but in some extent as aspirational, because the U.S. has sometimes carved out exceptions, and like sugar subsidies, for example, and doesn't always follow the rules. And China doesn't always want to follow the rules either. And I think the stress of adding China to some of these institutions with its very different system of governance has led to a lot of frustration, but much more frustration than there has been, actual plans of what to do about it that can productively lead the two countries to work, to be able to live with each other in an international system that's made up to a great extent of countries that are not the U.S. or China. And the reason I found it so interesting to write about those South Korean companies is you really see them in a tough geopolitical bind, where it's not really clear from either side what they can face, and they don't, their influence is limited because they're a third country. They're not in the biggest. And one of the main advantages, I think, of the ideals of the rules-based order was to try and simplify things and create some sustainability and stability for those countries based on at least somewhat predictable rules. So I hope that much of that can still be maintained. And my hope is also, and potentially even the base case, could be that we have a few areas of trade and economic engagement which are acknowledged as really relevant to national security. And in those areas, we see less interdependence between the U.S. and China, and also between other countries, because that's perceived as too risky. But then that hopefully the rest of the vast majority of the economy can continue to be one of interdependence. And the main thing the policymakers would be watching out for is just making sure it's not too lopsided, that one side's not getting too much influence over the other. And hopefully that could be some sort of stable thing, as long as relationship between the U.S. and China doesn't go off the rails, and as long as we can get some sort of predictability about the security implications of some of these new technologies, and that help us put guardrails around what is actually a real security issue that we want to control, and what is something that we should be wanting to be as efficient economically as possible to give low prices and best innovation to consumers. But that's my bias as an economist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think excellent points. Very well. So, Martin, do you have anything to add in terms of U.S.-China relation?
No, I think you asked some really, really thoughtful questions and pushed me to think a lot too. Very useful.
Okay, so thank you so much again for your time today and sharing your views. So hope to see you again.
Yep, thank you.